The legal deed felt heavier than the combined weight of every single mortgage I'd ever signed in my life. It was a $75 million portfolio, but for me, Nilda Davis, it was just the final chess piece. I knew exactly what that paper represented. Not just wealth, but unconditional power. And I knew exactly who was coming to try and take it. The only question was how loudly they would announce their greed. I'm Nilda Davis, and I'm 65 years old. My business isn't luxury hotels, it's ethical care. I built the Nilda Davis Wellness and Retirement Collection from the ground up, starting with a single renovated apartment complex outside of Dallas, Texas. I saw the need for dignified, quality senior living that focused on the resident, not the bottom line. Now, it's a highly successful chain of 5 premium retirement communities. We specialize in personalized care, putting integrity first. That reputation, that commitment to honesty, was worth more than any price tag. The $75 million valuation was just what the banks put on the buildings. The trust we built was priceless. Today was the day I made the transfer. Not upon my death, but while I was sitting right here, sharp as a tack, fully in control. The majority, controlling interest, was now in the hands of my granddaughter, Crystal Garcia. She was only 25, just graduated from business school, but she was worthy. She understood the why of the business. We had just finished a quiet, private ceremony in my study. Crystal held the deed folder, her hand trembling slightly, not from excitement, but from the sheer weight of responsibility and the realization of the target she'd just painted on her back. We didn't even get to raise a celebratory glass of iced tea. The bell chimed, and the front door opened, letting in a sudden, cold rush of air that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. It wasn't a pleasant surprise. My daughter, Charlotte, walked in first, her face set in that tight, brittle mask she wears when she's performing for someone important. Right behind her was her husband, Charles Lewis. Charles is a smooth-talking lobbyist based out of the Washington, D.C. area, a man who sells access and influence and believes money can smooth over any moral lapse. His suits are always bespoke, his smile is always too wide, and his confidence always smelled like cheap cologne and deceit. He's a vulture, plain and simple, and he'd circled this asset for years, waiting for me to be vulnerable. Charlotte stood silent, letting him lead. Charles didn't waste a second on congratulations or warmth. He went straight into the attack, his voice smooth and professional, yet instantly demanding. Nilda, I respect your vision. He started, already stepping too close to the mahogany table where the folder lay. But this is simply too much risk. We need to maintain stability in the market. Crystal is brilliant, of course, but she's inexperienced in multi-million-dollar asset management. He leaned down, placing his perfectly manicured hands flat on the table, practically claiming the deed with his posture. He didn't ask, he declared, I will need to step in as interim executive control immediately. It's about protecting the family asset from any volatility. We'll manage it together. Me overseeing the high-level finance, Crystal shadowing, and you can finally enjoy true retirement, stress-free. I didn't flinch. I just looked him straight in his overly confident eyes. In this family, my calm silence always meant the storm was coming. I let the silence hang there, heavy, significant, letting him see my refusal before I even spoke the words. That won't be necessary, Charles, I said, my voice quiet but firm, cutting through his corporate jargon. The asset is secure, and Crystal is the majority owner. The only volatility here is your sudden and rather transparent appearance. Charlotte finally spoke up, her voice sharp with manufactured concern, siding with him immediately. Mother, be reasonable. Charles knows the system inside and out. Crystal is just 25. 25 and legally responsible, I countered, looking pointedly at Crystal, who sat straighter, absorbing my strength. Charles saw this as a simple financial power grab, a grandmother trying to protect her legacy. He thought he was dealing with an old woman too tired to fight, someone who would roll over under pressure. He had no idea the game was already over. This wasn't about the $75 million. This was about something much, much older and far more painful. The control is crystals. He thought he was starting his ascent. I knew he had just stepped into the first hole of his own grave. This was the moment I realized the time for true, calculated justice had finally arrived. I didn't have to say another word. Charles's face, usually so composed, flushed a deep, ugly red. He knew I saw right through his corporate facade. He tried one more time, shifting his appeal to my daughter. "Charlotte, you see this, right? She's letting ego override good sense. We need to be a team." My daughter, however, didn't look at Charles. She looked at me, Nilda Davis, her own mother. Her eyes were hard, not with concern for the business, but with a deep-seated resentment that had festered for years. She hated that I was still successful, still capable, and still the one holding the power. "Mother, you're just trying to control the money from the grave." Charlotte sneered, missing the point entirely. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room echoing my resolve. The control is already settled. The meeting is over. They left in a storm of barely contained fury. As the front door closed, that familiar, oppressive quiet settled back into the house. But it wasn't the kind of peace you want. It was the quiet that hides deep, internal scars. That silence was Charles's legacy long before he tried to steal my money. If you've ever had to cut a toxic person out of your life, even if they share your blood, hit the like button right now. We need to know we're not the only ones who understand that unique pain of setting a boundary that's severe. Let me know in the comments if you've been there. My heart ached, but not for the $75 million Charles was after. It ached for Crystal Garcia, my granddaughter. When Crystal first came to live with me in Dallas, she existed in the shadows. She was only 16, a bright, compassionate teenager who suddenly looked like a ghost. I didn't have to press her for details. The truth hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Charles Lewis, the polished D.C. lobbyist, had been chipping away at her for years, not just with words, but with systematic emotional and financial manipulation. He made her feel foolish for her ambitions. He would ridicule her college application essays, calling her dreams childish and impractical. If she saved money from a summer job, he'd borrow it for a quick investment he swore would triple, only to forget to pay her back. He slowly and deliberately eroded her confidence, making her believe she was indebted to him, too naive to manage her own life, and utterly incapable of succeeding without his superior guidance. It was quiet, calculated abuse, the kind that leaves no bruise, only deep, crippling shame. The real, unforgivable wound, however, was delivered by Charlotte, my own daughter. When Crystal finally found the courage to speak up, not just about the borrowed money, but about the constant ridicule and the creeping sense of danger, Charlotte didn't listen. She didn't hug her daughter. She chose Charles. "Crystal, you're being dramatic," Charlotte told her, using the exact phrase Charles had coached her with. "Your stepfather is under a lot of pressure. He's trying to teach you responsibility. You're attention-seeking." Charlotte sacrificed her daughter's truth for the sake of her husband's prestige and, more importantly, her own carefully constructed social life in Washington. Charles was her ticket to the right parties and the right kind of money. Admitting his toxicity would mean admitting her life was a sham. So she packed Crystal's bags and sent her to me in Dallas, claiming Crystal needed stability. I knew the truth. Charlotte needed Crystal to be one less witness to the rot at the core of her marriage. I didn't send Crystal to a lawyer immediately. I sent her to a financial abuse counselor, someone who understood that the deep trauma wasn't just in the words spoken, but in the years of having her self-worth tied to the whims of a powerful, controlling man. Crystal was terrified of making decisions. She would ask my permission to buy groceries or even change the radio station. She had learned silence was the safest defense against people who used their position, mother and stepfather, to tear her down. My job, as Nilda Davis, was not to coddle her. It was to help her rebuild the walls inside herself. I became her anchor. I showed her through my own life. The long hours, the ethical struggles, the slow, satisfying growth of the collection, that integrity and hard work build something truly permanent. We pored over the original blueprints of the first retirement home. I told her, every building tells a story, Crystal. The walls remember who built them and why. We're going to build your story back, stronger this time. I saw her pain manifested in small ways. Her hands were never still. She'd compulsively trace the edges of the desk, trying to impose order on a world that had become chaos. Her voice was quiet, almost thin, the way a person talks when they fear being heard. I never forced her to talk about the past, but I gave her responsibility. I started with the meticulous, detailed work of auditing our vendor contracts. I needed her to trust her own judgment again. This slow, methodical work, the focus on building permanence and spotting structural flaws, became her unexpected therapy. It was the exact opposite of her mother's flimsy world of appearances. I knew the biggest fight was still ahead. It wasn't just about protecting the collection. It was about giving Crystal the ultimate, undeniable proof of her worth and her competence by making the man who broke her pay for his crimes in public, and by making her mother realize the devastating price of her own unforgivable choice. This was my silent promise, made on the day she walked into my home with nothing but a suitcase and a broken spirit. I wasn't just saving her from a snake, I was preparing her to cut its head off. The challenge wasn't just convincing Crystal that she was strong enough. It was showing her how to be strong. The pain of her past, the shame Charles had inflicted, that was the fuel we needed. I didn't let her continue with that architecture degree. That was her childhood dream, but her adult life required a different kind of precision. Her focus shifted entirely to forensic accounting and asset management. This wasn't about making money. It was about tearing down lies. I got her into the most intense, grueling courses I could find, teaching her how to trace money flows, spot ghost accounts, and identify systemic fraud. She wasn't learning how to run a business for profit. She was learning how to build an impenetrable defense, and more importantly, how to execute a targeted legal offense. My strategy was already fully formed. It relied entirely on Charles's arrogance. Charles Lewis's real identity, his true pride and life's work, wasn't being my son-in-law or a consultant. It was his thriving, privately held DC-based lobbying and government contracting firm. That firm was his self-worth, his network, and his endless stream of quiet, high-value income that kept him in bespoke suits and high society. The $75 million retirement collection was just a shiny status symbol he wanted to add to his list. The true, satisfying revenge wasn't taking the collection from him. It was stripping him of his most valuable asset, using the collection as the bait. I needed him on the inside. I needed him to think he was winning. A few days after his arrogant initial attempt, I called Charles and feigned exhaustion. My voice was low, tired, suggesting I was overwhelmed by the sudden decision to transfer assets. I played the part of the tired, old woman giving in. Charles, this is simply too much stress at my age. I sighed into the phone. I can't fight you on this. The board and the banks are also pushing for stabilization. I'll agree to allow you to serve as interim operations director. He practically purred over the phone. That's wonderful news, Nilda. Just think of the synergy we can achieve. I continued, maintaining the tired persona. However, the collection is tied to federal funding and compliance standards, as you know. The banks and I have a single, non-negotiable demand for this interim role. Since your firm is involved in government contracting, they require an unusually stringent personal guarantee clause. I explained that the clause required him to commit his personal assets as collateral against any decline in two critical areas: client satisfaction scores and regulatory compliance scores. I chose these two metrics for a reason. Charles is a lobbyist. He focuses on big financial wins and bottom-line cuts. He knows nothing about the daily, granular work required to keep a senior care facility ethical and compliant. He would look at the $75 million, look at the high salary I offered for the interim role, and completely overlook the fine print on those specific operational metrics. He'd see them as administrative hurdles, not fatal flaws. I sent the contract over the next day. It was dozens of pages, buried deep within a financial restructuring agreement. The key clause stated, a drop of 20% or more in both annual client satisfaction metrics and state-mandated regulatory compliance scores from the previous fiscal year shall result in the immediate and total forfeiture of the collateralized asset specifically identified as the entirety of Charles Lewis Consulting, CLC. Charles, arrogant and fixated only on the headline number and the title of director, signed the guarantee without consulting his own specialized legal team on the specific compliance metrics. He saw the high salary. He saw the easy target of the $75 million empire. And he didn't see the trap. He believed he was simply signing a standard business liability waiver. He was so confident in his ability to manipulate the numbers and cut costs that he walked right into the ambush. He sent the signed document back to Dallas with a smug note about commencing synergy. Crystal, and I just looked at the fax signature. He had committed his life's work, his multi-million-dollar lobbying firm, as the collateral to guarantee a business he knew nothing about. This was the quiet, brutal satisfaction I had been waiting for. Now, the battle wasn't about defending my assets. It was about ensuring his swift, catastrophic professional downfall. Crystal, sitting beside me, didn't smile. She just nodded, her eyes focused. She was ready. The trap was set, and the snake was now fully inside the cage. Charles Lewis didn't waste a single hour. He saw his high salary and the potential prize of my entire retirement collection, and he behaved exactly as I knew he would, like a corporate barbarian. He showed up at our Dallas headquarters the next morning, not to observe, but to dismantle. He marched into the administrative offices in that crisp DC suit, acting like a conquering hero. His immediate goal wasn't long-term stability. It was stripping costs for quick quarterly gains that would impress the financial institutions and, more importantly, fuel his ego. The first cuts were swift and ruthless. He fired 3 of our most specialized, high-tenure care staff, employees who had been with me for 15 years, experts in geriatric nutrition, and specialized memory care. His justification was that their salaries were unnecessary overhead. He replaced them with minimum-wage contract workers who lacked the necessary training and, frankly, the dedication. He called it optimizing labor. Next, he deferred critical maintenance across the Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio properties. We had a scheduled overhaul of the HVAC systems, essential for the health of our vulnerable residents, that he pushed back indefinitely, claiming the funds were better spent on branding initiatives. He gutted the budgets for activities and personalized dietary plans, the very things that make the Nilda Davis collection an ethical, desirable place to live. He saw our residents as units of profit, not people. I watched him. Crystal watched him. We didn't intervene. We simply allowed him to have enough rope to hang himself. In the senior care industry, especially one tied to stringent state and federal funding like ours, quick cost-cutting is not just bad business. It's illegal negligence. I knew that replacing specialized staff with cheap labor and deferring essential safety maintenance would lead to 2 inevitable results that were guaranteed to trigger the personal guarantee clause, compliance violations, and a devastating drop in client satisfaction scores. The danger Charles posed went far beyond my financial loss. He was actively risking the health and well-being of the elderly residents who trusted us. This is where the anger burns hottest for me, Nilda Davis, and I know it burns for many of you watching this. We, as seniors, often rely on the promise of dignity and quality care. To see a man like Charles, a DC lobbyist who specialized in manipulating regulations, treat our residents as mere obstacles to quick cash, that's not just business, that's a betrayal of trust on the most fundamental level. His eventual defeat had to be absolute, not just for us, but for the principle of decency. Crystal's role during this time was quiet, relentless, and absolutely essential. Her studies in forensic accounting had turned her into a formidable analyst. She wasn't fighting him in the boardroom. She was fighting him in the ledgers and the daily reports. Every time Charles fired a skilled nurse, Crystal logged the resulting increase in incident reports. Every time he deferred a necessary repair, she cross-referenced it with the relevant state health code, marking it as a regulatory infraction. When the cheap replacement staff inevitably resulted in complaints about cold food, slow response times, and poor attitudes, Crystal meticulously tracked every single resident survey that dragged down our client satisfaction scores. She wasn't just collecting proof. She was building a mountain of evidence. I had taught her that Charles's kind of arrogance always leaves a paper trail, and her job was to follow that trail until it led directly to the end of his career. One afternoon, Crystal showed me a report. Charles had ordered non-essential cosmetic landscaping at the Dallas facility just to impress a potential investor, while simultaneously failing to replace broken fire extinguishers in the Houston facility, a clear OSHA violation. He doesn't even know what he's looking at, Grandma, Crystal said, her voice steady. He sees a cost center, not a community. He doesn't see the liability in that fire extinguisher, only the price of the flowers. I nodded, feeling a deep surge of pride. The shy, broken teenager who came to me years ago was gone. Standing before me was a quiet, cold warrior who understood that her meticulous attention to detail was now the only thing standing between Charles and his total professional destruction. She had turned his abusive tactics, his need for secrecy, his belief that details didn't matter, back against him. By the end of the third week, Crystal's report confirmed it. Charles's reckless cuts had resulted in a 28% drop in documented regulatory compliance and a 35% decline in client satisfaction over the baseline figures. These were not subjective numbers. These were hard facts verified by industry auditors and resident surveys. The conditions for the forfeiture of his DC lobbying firm were met. Charles Lewis, the man who believed he was above the rules, had finally signed his own termination notice, all for the sake of a quick, quarterly profit. The trap was sprung. The trap was sprung. Crystal had provided the absolute proof. The audit reports were chillingly precise. Charles's changes resulted in a 28% drop in documented regulatory compliance and a 35% drop in client satisfaction over the mandated baseline. These weren't soft metrics. These were the hard facts that trigger state oversight and, more immediately, the forfeiture clause. The snake was completely tangled in his own corporate knots. I didn't let the tension cool. I sent a formal, hand-delivered invitation to Charles and Charlotte for a final celebratory dinner that same evening at my Dallas home. The atmosphere that night was thick enough to cut with a butter knife. I had the dining room set formally, crystal and silver gleaming under the chandelier. Charles walked in first, smelling of triumph, and that same cheap cologne. He believed he was coming to collect his prize. He assumed the dinner was my final act of surrender before transferring the remaining legal details. Charlotte, draped in a new designer dress I knew she couldn't afford on her own, looked triumphant, already spending the imaginary money. They saw the elaborate dinner and thought I was just trying to ease the sting of defeat. They were completely wrong. I was honoring the gravity of the occasion. We sat down, Crystal and I on one side, Charles and Charlotte facing us. Crystal was a rock. She didn't offer a polite smile or nervous chatter. She just sat straight, waiting. Charles was, naturally, the first to break the tense silence. He launched into a lengthy, self-congratulatory speech about his strategic vision and how he planned to bring the collection into the 21st century. He used words like synergy and optimization, so often they lost all meaning. He didn't realize he was delivering his own professional eulogy. Then Charlotte jumped in, laying on the manipulation one last time. She placed her hand over mine on the table, a gesture of affection she hadn't offered in years, and squeezed. "Mother, you're doing the right thing for the family harmony," she cooed, her voice sickly sweet. "It's time to put all this fighting behind us. Charles and I will take care of everything. We can be a proper family again." I pulled my hand back gently. Her words, family harmony, hit me like a blow. This was the same woman who had thrown her terrified daughter out because she threatened her husband's image. She had traded her child's safety for social standing. And now she was using emotional blackmail to secure a financial windfall. "Charlotte," I said, my voice steady, "I assure you I am doing the right thing for the family. I had to hurt my own daughter tonight to save my granddaughter and validate the sacrifice Crystal had made." This moment, facing Charlotte's betrayal head-on, was the most painful part of the entire plan. She was choosing the lie right up to the very end. The conviction I felt was absolute, but the sorrow was deep. The fight for your boundaries is never easy, especially when it involves your children. If my story resonates with a difficult choice you've faced, please take a moment to subscribe right now. We're building a community of strength here, and I want you to be part of it. Charles, oblivious to the emotional current, pushed the deeds toward Crystal. "Now, Crystal, just sign these final papers transferring the management rights, and we can all move forward peacefully. Interim control is simply the first step." I smiled, a cold, hard smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Oh, Charles, we are moving forward, but not the way you think." I nodded to Crystal. She didn't hesitate. She stood up, walked to the sideboard, and returned with 2 folders that looked identical to the deed, placing them squarely in the center of the table. "Mr. Lewis," Crystal said, her voice clear and strong, a sound I hadn't heard from her in years. "As the majority owner of the Nilda Davis collection, I must now address a significant contract violation." Charles stiffened, his professional composure finally cracking. He didn't see the checkmate coming. He only smelled the sweet scent of his impending victory. He was about to be proven wrong in the most public, professional way possible, and he didn't have a single move left on the board. "Mr. Lewis," Crystal said, her voice clear and strong, "as the majority owner of the Nilda Davis collection, I must now address a significant contract violation." Charles recoiled slightly. He looked over at Charlotte, then back at me, still grasping for control. "A violation? Nilda, stop this nonsense. The company is performing exactly as expected under my stabilization plan." He tried to dismiss it, to brush it away with a wave of his hand. I smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. "Your stabilization plan, Charles, achieved a 28% drop in documented regulatory compliance and a 35% decline in client satisfaction. That's not stabilization. That's professional negligence. And it triggers the contract you personally signed." I nodded to Crystal. She was the one delivering the final blow, proving her competence against the man who tried to erase it. She opened the first folder and pushed the top 2 pages across the table toward him. The first page was the personal guarantee clause he had signed, highlighted in bright yellow, clearly stating the forfeiture penalty for failing to meet the mandated compliance metrics. The second page was the official audit report, backed by state agency metrics, confirming the catastrophic drops that he caused by cutting corners on staff and maintenance. Charles's face went white. He grabbed the papers, his eyes scanning the technical language he had arrogantly ignored just weeks earlier. The color drained from his expensive suit. He finally understood the trap. "You manipulated the audit," he stammered, his voice losing its expensive polish. "This is slander. You let the company fail." "I set a baseline of integrity for a senior care facility," I countered, leaning forward slightly. "You chose to fire competent, specialized staff and defer fire safety inspections. Your greed, Charles, not my action, caused those scores to plummet." Then I delivered the crushing blow. I pushed the second folder, the heavy one, across the table. "Under the terms you signed," I stated calmly, "the penalty for breach is the immediate and total forfeiture of the collateralized asset." My eyes locked on his. "Congratulations, Charles. The Charles Lewis consulting firm now legally belongs to the Nilda Davis Trust. You broke your promise, and you lost your most prized possession." His DC lobbying firm, his entire identity, was gone. He stared at the court order for the immediate asset forfeiture of CLC, signed by a Texas judge hours earlier. He had mortgaged his entire future to steal an empire he never earned. Charlotte finally shrieked, her own devastation far more dramatic than Charles's silent shock. "No, Charles, tell her that's not possible. That's your business." She looked at me, pure hatred replacing the sickly sweet concern. "Mother, you can't do this. You'll ruin him." "He ruined himself," I said simply, "and he ruined my granddaughter's life for years. This is simply the cost of doing business with integrity." But the revenge wasn't just about taking his money. It was about stripping his identity and forcing him to serve the person he abused. That was the stronger revenge. Crystal picked up a final document, holding it up for both of them to see. The court order includes another clause, "Mr. Lewis, to mitigate the ethical damage you caused in the senior care industry, you are mandated to spend the next 12 months working pro bono for a local nonprofit focused on elder care ethics and compliance. You will use your consulting skills for forced community service." His skill, his prestige, his network, all stripped bare. He was legally shackled to the consequences of his own moral failure, forced to clean up a mess that mirrored the damage he caused in our family. Charlotte's collapse was devastating to watch. She finally realized the depth of her own loss. She hadn't just lost the chance at millions, she had lost her status, her wealthy husband, and the high society life she chose over her daughter. She stared at Charles, seeing him for the petty, defeated fraud he truly was, and then she stared at Crystal, seeing the woman she should have protected. The humiliation was absolute. She had lost everything because she prioritized his lies over her child's truth. Charles Lewis sat there, professionally decimated, silenced by the power of his own signature. The atmosphere was absolute zero. Charlotte was sputtering, her hand clamped over her mouth as if to hold back a scream. Charles sat frozen, his expensive suit now feeling like a financial straitjacket. His life's work, the firm that gave him his identity and his status, was now legally mine, all because he was too arrogant to read the fine print on a regulatory compliance clause. The final execution of the plan was swift and quiet, exactly how serious business should be handled. Within 48 hours, my legal team in Dallas and their counterparts in the Mid-Atlantic executed the takeover of Charles Lewis Consulting, CLC. There were no messy public court battles. The contract was ironclad, and his own signature was the final damning piece of evidence. Charles Lewis was professionally ruined, stripped of his entire asset base, and his professional license in the D.C. area was suspended pending review of the regulatory compliance breaches he caused here. He went from being a powerful lobbyist to a man with no firm, no reputation, and a mandatory year of unpaid community service. The humiliation was total. Now came the important part, the repair. This wasn't about vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was about honoring the true mission of the Nilda Davis collection. Crystal, now operating with a quiet, steely authority, took her first decisive action as the majority owner. She didn't pause to celebrate. She immediately directed the liquidation of unnecessary assets from the newly acquired CLC firm. This wasn't to fund her own lifestyle. It was to fix his damage. She used Charles's money to immediately fund a massive compliance overhaul and salary increase for the care staff. The funds were allocated to hire back the specialized geriatric nurses Charles had fired, reinstate the full budget for resident activities, and perform the immediate, mandatory HVAC and safety maintenance across all 5 properties. She was using the assets of the abuser to heal the victims and restore the integrity of the business. It was the purest form of restorative justice. I watched her execute these moves, signing off on multimillion-dollar transactions with the cool confidence of a seasoned CEO. The frightened silence that had defined her for years was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet authority grounded in facts and competence. That was the true measure of her healing. She wasn't relying on me anymore. She was leading. Charlotte's journey ended with a whimper, not a bang. She didn't have the emotional capacity to stay and face the wreckage. The DC social circles that had once courted her quickly froze her out. The shame of her husband's financial and professional collapse, combined with the whispers about her role in her own daughter's trauma, was too much for her brittle facade. Within weeks, facing financial ruin and social shame, she left Charles. Her journey wasn't one of redemption or forgiveness. It was the absolute, undeniable consequence of her own choices. She prioritized the illusion of wealth over her own daughter's well-being, and she lost everything because of that choice. I looked at Crystal across the office table. She didn't show triumph, just relief. The weight had finally lifted. She had faced the very person who tried to destroy her self-worth, and she had dismantled his entire life using the very rules of finance and accountability he thought he could manipulate. My role was done. I had used my legacy, my $75 million empire, as a tool for masterclass revenge, ensuring the man who abused my granddaughter didn't just lose money, but lost his entire identity and was forced to perform penance. More importantly, I had proven to Crystal that she was not a victim, but a formidable, capable woman who was finally free. The intense conflict was over, but the work was not. Crystal and I had secured the future of the Nilda Davis collection, but the real reward was the peace we earned after the fight. Life settled into a new, purposeful rhythm. Crystal, taking the reins as majority owner, didn't stop at just winning the lawsuit. She successfully restructured the collection, making it a national model for ethical, resident-focused care. The negative publicity Charles had attempted to create vanished under the weight of her swift, corrective actions. The Nilda Davis Wellness and Retirement Collection didn't just survive. It thrived, earning the distinction of being one of the highest rated in the U.S. for ethical care and resident satisfaction. She achieved this by consistently prioritizing people over profit, the core principle Charles had ignored. I moved into a role as a senior advisor, watching with immense pride as Crystal handled complex transactions and difficult decisions with ease. The shy teenager, who was once terrified to speak, was now negotiating with bankers and state regulators. Her silence was truly gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable confidence that was palpable. That was the most gratifying part of the entire ordeal. As for Charles Lewis, he spent his mandated year working for the nonprofit, stripped of his prestige, his network, and his salary. His attempts to sue were easily dismissed because the contract he signed was ironclad, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was a cautionary tale in DC business circles, the man who lost his multi-million-dollar firm over his own arrogance and cruelty. Charlotte eventually divorced Charles, but her fate was far lonelier than his. She was left facing the ruins of a life built on superficiality. She lost the wealth she craved and the social standing she valued. She made no attempt to reconcile with Crystal, confirming that her choices were final. My sorrow over losing my daughter to her own vanity remains, but the peace of protecting my granddaughter is a greater comfort. I often look back on the whole journey. I realized the inheritance wasn't the money. The $75 million was just a tool. The true inheritance I gave Crystal was the courage to set ironclad boundaries and the blueprint for self-respect. It cost us a relationship with a toxic family member, but it gained us freedom, integrity, and peace. We didn't build a financial dynasty. We rebuilt the foundation of our own lives. The fight took years, but the peace we have now is worth every single minute of it. Tell me, what's the hardest boundary you ever had to draw to protect yourself or your children? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story gave you the strength to stand up for yourself today, please share it with a friend who needs it and subscribe so we can keep building this community of strength.